Hello, great to be here. I'm just going to make sure my microphone is set up. Hi, it's good to see you. I already see some comments. Welcome. Hello, good to see you. So nice to have you from Cuba. Welcome. So I'm very excited for today's live training. Welcome to the Beyond English Fluency session. If you don't know, I'm Gemma Keeling. It's so good to have you join us. Let us know where you are listening from. So in today's session, I'm really looking forward to sharing some particular phrases. So have you ever been in a situation where someone said something that didn't quite match what they actually wanted to express? So a few examples. If someone tells you, I'm not hungry, and then you order something and then they eat your food, so you know that what they say is not really the truth. Now, there are a few reasons for this. Sometimes it can be because phrases and statements have multiple different meanings or shades of meaning. So for example, if someone says to you, it's not urgent, or maybe I'm not bad. If someone asks you, how are you doing today? I'm not bad. Now, not bad can have really a spectrum of meanings. It can mean, I'm doing okay. Or it can mean I'm having a really terrible day and I don't really want to talk about it, so I would just say, I'm not bad. Now, on the other hand, you might be having a really wonderful day, but you're speaking to someone who doesn't seem so happy. Maybe they've had a really difficult day. So instead of saying, yes, I've had a really wonderful day, you might again say, yeah, I'm not bad. So phrases like this can have multiple meanings. And while, sometimes it's not going to be an issue if someone says, I'm not bad, and maybe you want to kind of go further and understand how they're feeling. Now, it is really essential, though, to understand the various shades of meaning. And especially in a professional situation, I've had this come up multiple times within my own community, and I've also had it in my own professional experience working at companies where maybe your manager or your colleague will tell you something, and it's not always that clear by the phrase. And this is especially true if you are working in an international company. So if you have colleagues, for example, from the UK, like me, I'm from the south of England, and if you are working with those, for example, in the United States, it might be that the understanding of how positive a phrase is will be different. And I'll give you some examples later. So if you've just joined or you're watching the replay, hello. It's great to have you here. We have Sarah from Brazil. Great to see you here today. Welcome. If you've just joined, I'd love to know where you're listening from. And I'm going to be sharing all about particular phrases today that have hidden meanings and some ways that we can overcome that. So I have quite a few examples to share with you. And so like I said, it can be a problem in a professional situation. And I want to tell you a story. So there was one time that I was working with a product designer who was working with a company based in the US. And English was not her first language. And one day, she told me that she had a meeting with her manager, and she was discussing a project with her manager. And she proposed an idea. And to her surprise, her manager was like, yes, let's do it. That sounds great. Let's do it. And she was very happy, and her manager was on board. However, she didn't fully grasp the context of the meaning, let's do it. Because let's do it is let us do it. Now, it's a very vague statement because how she assumed her manager, what she was saying, she assumed that her manager was going to do the tasks. And her manager assumed that she was going to do the tasks. And actually, if you say, let's do it, it can imply I'm doing it, you're doing it, or we're both doing it. So it is quite a confusing, on the behalf of what the manager said was confusing. However, the reason why the manager didn't say, why she chose that language is part of cultural differences and also how direct you are as a communicator. She didn't want to say, perhaps as a manager, you do this, which maybe is the right thing to do. She was also from, a culture, or the way she spoke, it was just implied, and she expected that there was an assumption that she would do it because the manager was telling her to do it. And the next week when they met, they realized the miscommunication. Luckily, they were able to laugh about it, and she was able to, they were met with like, wait, I thought you were doing it. And she felt really terrible. But luckily, her manager was very understanding, and luckily it wasn't the worst situation. But it was a mistake on both of those behalves. One of them, the manager should really clarify instead of saying, let's do this or let's do it. But actually, she was expecting, expectations that that her employee would do the project and take the lead on that particular project. Neither of them had communicated clearly their intentions, and they had a different understanding of this phrase, let's do it. So the result was that neither of them had completed the tasks. There was a pushback in the timeline, and luckily she was able to laugh about this experience, and definitely both of them learned that, clarity and communication and not making assumptions, which is always good, even if, English is your first language, or you're working in in your first language with colleagues that, it's not always a language barrier. Sometimes it's just the style of communication that can cause issues. But I did want to share some particular phrases and what they might mean on the surface, and actually the difference in meaning or the intention behind the meaning. So what someone says and what they really means. Just like if someone says, I'm not hungry, and they actually are very hungry. So it's a good example that I'm sure many of you can relate to. But I just wanted to welcome, we have Paola, welcome. Great to have you here from Colombia. So nice to see you. I hope you're having a wonderful afternoon. So I'm going to be sharing some of those particular phrases. Now, there's a few lessons from this, is never making assumptions. And I will be sharing more ways that you can overcome or really further understand the deeper meaning later. But I wanted to really share how you can ensure clear communication and understand the nuances. So the nuances are the shades or the different meanings, very slight different meanings of language, and what someone says versus what they mean. So hopefully by the end of the session, you'll really gain some valuable insights into when it comes to the different phrases that people use and how to handle these situations or understand the deeper meaning more effectively. So firstly, I am going to share the first example with you. And the first example, I really think about if someone is giving you feedback or making a comment in a meeting if you share an idea. So for example, they might say this particular phrase, that's interesting. Now, typically, if someone says that's interesting, now, of course, it depends on your intonation and your voice and how you say it. That also gives a lot of meaning to our words. But typically, the word interesting is a positive word in English. However, it doesn't always have a positive meaning as a phrase. So it can mean, that's interesting, means I'm expressing genuine interest or curiosity. I think really that is interesting is a positive phrase. Now, depending on where you are from, does depend on how positive you might see language. And one of the big differences is, now, of course, I don't want to stereotype, but there's been a lot of research into those from the UK versus the US and how they view particular language. And typically, those in the US, people from the United States, are more likely to interpret language in a positive way than those in the UK. So if someone from the US, how they really perceive the language and really understand the language, if someone says, that's interesting, and they're from the US, it's usually, generally, a positive reaction. And sometimes, however, it can be, responding, it's not a really strong emotion. It's like, okay, that's interesting. It's maybe indifferent. It's somewhere neutral in the middle. However, in the UK, it's more likely that it's not as seen as positively than it is in the UK. So if your manager, for example, is from the UK and says that's interesting, depending on the context and, also there's a few other aspects that come into this, like personality, but very generally, that's interesting can have a different meaning. If someone says that's interesting, it could be a polite way to say something is odd or unusual, and perhaps they don't love the idea. They might say, okay, that's interesting. But the reason they do this is to avoid being confrontational. They don't want to make you feel bad. So if you share something and they say, okay, that's interesting, have we considered this? And if they give an alternative, then they don't want to necessarily dismiss what you are saying and say, okay, that's a really terrible idea. So there are good intentions sometimes behind using this language. They, want to save face. They would prefer not to make you feel disappointed. And in a way, it's lying. It's saying, that's interesting. That's an interesting idea, but have we also considered this alternative option? Now, in that case, it's typically they want to, address, and maybe it's not seen as, it's a polite way of saying, actually, that's a really bad idea. That's interesting, but have you considered something else? So that's one example of how just one phrase can have completely different meanings and contextual understanding based on your culture as well. So like I mentioned, between whether you're from the UK or from the United States, and I say those countries because there's been quite a lot of research into, they've done many surveys, and I can share one of the surveys. It's quite interesting to see, are you more of the way you interpret language, is it more of an American way or more of a British English way? And it's very interesting. I'll share it with you later. And for example, it has how negative on a scale of 1 to 10 would you rate particular words? So for example, how would you rate brilliant? Now, brilliant is in the UK a very positive word, whereas in the US, maybe it's not so much. And words like abysmal, which means terrible, very bad, is a very negative word. So there's a rating scale, and they've given this survey to many people from the UK and the US to really understand how language is understood by people from different cultures. I find it very fascinating. And why this really is relevant is if you are working with an international team, it could be that there are situations where you are getting pushback for your decisions, for your design decisions, for your ideas. And it's not always that the pushback is very obvious. It's not always very confrontational. And sometimes we have to read between the lines of what someone says and the true intentions behind the phrases and the language that they're using. It's also important for you to consider, if you are sharing, with your team who might be from the US or the UK, how they might perceive the language that you are using and you are choosing to share. So that's one example, is that's interesting, which can be positive or relatively neutral or also very negative. So I'm just going to, it looks like we have more people joining. We have Ivan from Mexico. So lovely to have you join us. I hope everything is going well and you're having a good afternoon. We have Jocelyn, so nice to see you. How are you doing? So good to see you here. So I would love to know, have you, maybe it's in English or it could be in your own language, but do you have any particular phrases or words that can be interpreted in many different ways? So for example, the word interesting. That's interesting can mean it's very positive, I'm curious, I would like to know more. It's an interesting perspective. And it's generally positive, but it can also mean, actually, it's very interesting, is very peculiar and odd and maybe weird, which has a negative connotation, a negative understanding. Can you think of any words, maybe in English or in your own language, as examples of particular phrases that someone says and what they actually mean? So that's interesting, I think, is one particular example. I'm going to share some more, but I'd love to hear from you if you can share any in English or maybe even in your own language if you have examples like this too. Looks like we got Doug with us. Hi, great to have you here from Brazil. Very nice. We have a few from Brazil watching. Shout out to my Brazilians. Good to have you here. So in today's session, I'm sharing different phrases. And the next phrase that I wanted to share is, that's not urgent, or it's not urgent. And if someone says to you, it's not urgent, it can be taken in a positive way to reassure you. So it's not urgent, don't worry about it, is reassuring you that there's no pressure, there's no rush. Now, it can be that you're just, very neutral. I'm just stating a fact about the timeline, and it's not too much of a problem either way. It's quite neutral. However, it can be suggesting that it's not important, it's not a priority, because it's not urgent, forget about it. You don't even need to do that. However, it can also be, depending on the situation, not so much negative, but it can have the opposite meaning of, no, it's not urgent, but really it is, and it's very urgent. But it can have, in this case, maybe 4 different meanings of positive to reassure you, there's no immediate pressure or rush, it's no worries, not a problem, it's not urgent. However, it can also be just to state, it's not urgent, it's quite neutral, I'm just stating a fact about the timeline. It can also be, it's not urgent, which could mean forget about it. Don't worry, it's not important, it's not a priority, just forget it. It's not urgent. We can come back to that maybe next year or next week, but it's not urgent. And another reason someone might say it's not urgent, which I know is very confusing, is actually it is very urgent, and they don't maybe want to pressure you, just like the example I gave with the manager said, let's do this. It's very unclear. And maybe you think, okay, that's not the best way to communicate. But the reality is people do, this is how communication works. There are people who will say one thing and mean something completely different. Another thing is, and many of these examples are adjectives. So, for example, interesting or unique. If someone says, okay, you have a unique perspective, that could be, unique has a positive understanding of, yeah, it's original, it's creative. Unique can mean something very positive. Now, it can also be negative, and negative as unique can mean unconventional or unusual or strange and weird. And if someone is giving you feedback to say you have a unique perspective, always, how you can really overcome this is always ask for an example or always ask for further clarification. That's the best way to really handle this. And all of the examples I've shared, maybe not that's interesting, that one's a little bit different. But if someone says to you, let's do this next week, and it's not clear who or the when or how, in that case, the example I gave with my own client, in that case, she should have just clarified and said, okay, I just want to make sure that we're on the same page and I understand everything correctly. You would like me to do this by next week, or how are we going to proceed? What are the expectations? That would have really clarified everything very easily. So if there are any confusion between situations, if it's not clear on expectations of what you're supposed to do, I always either summarize and say, okay, from my understanding, this is what you would like me to do by next week, or from the way I see it, or from my understanding, is this correct? I just want to clarify. That way you're summarizing, or you might ask questions. So would you like me to do this by this time? Is there anything else you'd like me to do? And really asking a question, and you're probing to get more information. So if anyone ever uses language that isn't clear, especially in a professional situation, always try to clarify the intention behind their meaning. Yes, Ivan has said, indeed, interesting can sound like strange in face of other facts if you are presenting some information or report. Yeah. So if someone says interesting to you, or that's interesting, how do you perceive that? Of course, it depends on, okay, that's interesting, which would mean quite negative. But if someone says, oh, that's interesting, and of course, my intonation when I'm excited, I will go up and say, that's interesting, then it's likely to be more positive. But not thinking about that. If someone maybe wrote you a message and said, that's interesting, no emojis, just that's interesting, how negative or positive would you rate that? Like 1 being extremely negative, very, very negative, or 10 being very positive. 5 is right in the middle. How would you rate that as a word? I'd love to hear what you say. Maybe you can let me know. Would you have interesting as a 5? That's interesting as a 5 or a 6? Or maybe you would have it lower than that. I'd love to hear what you think of how negative or positive that phrase is to you. But Ivan is right that it can sound like interesting is strange. Yeah, Ivan said 5. A 5. Okay. And depending on where you're from is how you will perceive that. Like I said, typically those in the United Kingdom are more likely to perceive phrases like this as more negative than those from the United States. Whereas someone from the United States might say 5.5 or 6 for how positive interesting is. Whereas someone from the UK are more likely to say maybe 5 or 4.5. It's actually, somewhere in the middle, or maybe a little bit more negative, which doesn't sound that different, but it's really how you're perceiving the language that you're using and the language that you might say and that others are also using. So I'm going to share another example of this, and this time it's if, for example, you are proposing an option. So you might present an idea or propose some information, and it could be the language you hear is I'll consider it. So I will consider it. I'll consider it. Now, if someone says I will consider it or I'll consider it, this can be positive. It can mean I'm open to exploring this idea. Yeah, okay, for sure, I'll consider it. It can also be quite neutral in you're indicating some hesitation. Maybe you will consider it, but you're not very enthusiastic about it. Or it could be completely, I am not going to consider it. I'm just humoring you. I don't want to be rude, and I'll consider it. And it's indicating really a lack of enthusiasm. It's not the best idea. I'm hesitating. So that's another phrase really of how, that has multiple meanings and nuances, is I'll consider it. Many of these, as you probably have noticed, are linked to giving feedback. So, for example, that's interesting, or I'll consider it, or you did an okay job. Now, okay, for me is terrible. If someone says, okay, you did okay, that to me sounds like something is wrong. Yeah, you did okay. You did an okay job. And that's satisfactory. It could be, relatively positive, that you did a satisfactory job. It wasn't bad. It wasn't great. You did okay. Now, for some, it can be just a straightforward assessment, not really a lot of enthusiasm. But it can, and for me, if someone said you did an okay job, what they're implying is disappointment. So that's how I see it. Maybe you think slightly different to me, and that's okay. And but the word, if someone says that's an okay job, that's somewhere in the middle. Now, another one is if someone says, if you have, for example, and I think about this example, when I was writing my university dissertation, I had to write, 20,000 words of research. And my professor told me, I have made a few, or you need to make a few amends. So you have to make some changes. Now, if someone says you have to make some changes, some is the word that could be confusing here. Or you need to make a few changes. Now, typically, a few or a couple of changes could be two. A couple is two. Few could be 3 changes. However, someone that says you have to make a few changes, when I heard that from my professor, my first reaction was, oh no, I have to rewrite everything. It's terrible. And by a few changes, she did mean I had to write a lot. It was almost rewriting everything again. And the reason why is we want to soften our language. And it's very common for people to soften their language in a way of really not maybe worrying the other person, to not make the other person feel very bad. And also, as a form of politeness, we might soften, instead of saying, stop making noise, you might soften that by asking a question, or, can you stop making noise? Or you might say, can you make a little less noise? And using these phrases like a little less to really soften what you're saying. And this example of, there's a few changes. You need to make a few changes. If someone said that to you, what is your reaction? Do you think I need to change everything? Just like me, my reaction was, okay, I've done terrible. I have to change everything. Or it could be, okay, I have a few, that's maybe 3, nothing too crazy, no problem. Or maybe your perspective is, okay, a few, yeah, that's good. So it's interesting to really understand the contextual understanding of language, of why we might do this. And sometimes it's to be polite. And this is something that I teach in my own course, something that I've done this week with the group that I'm running at the moment. And it's always interesting to hear the perspective of people from different countries. And sometimes this is quite surprising, which is a reason why I wanted to share this with you today, because we don't always take the time to think about language. Even as a native speaker, you're not thinking, oh, I'm using this particular language. It can be seen in a negative way or a really positive way, unless you're a linguist, unless that you really pay, some you pay a lot of attention to the language, but typically it's not something you usually think about. But it is important because if you are the one giving feedback to your team, or perhaps someone is giving feedback to you, it can be difficult to really understand the true intention unless you understand the meanings of phrases and also cultural differences and cultural understandings. So I can think of an example in Spanish, and I've also, I had someone who is from Brazil, and she told me this is also a problem in Brazil. So if anyone's from Brazil, you can let me know. And the problem in Mexico is if someone says to you, maybe, typically a maybe is no. But in Mexico, people have, typically they don't like to use the word no. And culturally, it can seem very direct to say no, thank you, or no, I don't want that. And instead of saying no, they will say maybe. And that is because they don't want to make the other person feel bad. And my friend from Brazil also told me that's the same in Brazil. Brazilians have a problem to say no. I don't know if it's like that in your country. We have a few Spanish speakers here from Cuba, Colombia, Mexico. And we also have a few of you from Brazil. So let me know how the word maybe is perceived, because in Mexico, a maybe is a polite way to say no. However, in the UK, maybe really is just a maybe. It's neutral. And in the, if someone says to me, yeah, maybe I will see you next week, I think there is a possibility. There is a possibility that I will see them next week. However, maybe for you, if someone says, yeah, maybe I'll see you next week, that could mean, yeah, I definitely won't see you next week, maybe next month, maybe next year, but not next week. However, like I said, typically those in the US are more likely to see language in a positive way. So if you say, yeah, maybe I'll see you next week, that is perceived in more likely a yes. Not always, but a maybe has a bit more of a positive understanding in English. Whereas I know living in Mexico, and I've heard from many of my students that maybe is a polite way to say no. I'd love to hear what you think about that. I find it very interesting. And for me, that has caused a few cultural barriers and a few cultural, I guess, surprises where I was, and this is the problem, is an expectation. I wanted to, if I'm making arrangements with my friends and they say, yeah, maybe we can do that. In my head, I think, okay, yeah, let's arrange something. And really, they're just being polite. And that, I expect that it's a yes. And also on the other end, if I sometimes, and I can think of an example, I once went into a shop and I was looking at something and I had to go to another shop. So I said to the store, the store manager was there, and I said, and they asked me, was there anything else? And I said, okay, yeah, thank you. Maybe I will come back. I will come back in a moment. I just need to go and then I will come back. I'm really interested, but I will come back. And I realized from their reaction, they were very upset. They're like, oh. And at first I just thought, okay, maybe he's just sad. But I realized that that's something that people do in Mexico if they want to be polite and just leave. They'll say, yeah, maybe I'll come back. I will come back. But really that's saying, I'm not interested in buying your stuff. I'm not going to buy this. I'm just going to be polite and pretend that I'm coming back. So I realized that if I say maybe or I'm coming back, people don't believe me. And then when I did, I stuck to my words, and I went to another shop and I came back, and they were surprised, like, oh, she didn't lie. So I found that very funny, but that was a big cultural difference, and that's just of my personal life living in Mexico. But I know it can also impact in business if you're working with clients, and if someone says maybe can, depending on where they're from, really be a polite way of saying no. So Ivan said, it happens a bit in Brazil as well. In Latin, we tend to not say bluntly, no. I'm Brazilian, by the way. Yeah. Okay. That's great to hear. I know that you're Brazilian living in Mexico, so you have a great understanding of this, of really how people understand maybe and no. And I think we have also Doug here. Doug is from Brazil. I don't know if he's watching now, but it's something, and it can be, cultural, but it's also personality. I think that also plays, there are a lot of different reasons for the choice of language we use, the intentions behind it. It's not just based on the country we're from. And many of us might be from one country, but we have a family member, like a parent, from another country. And that can also make things quite interesting. Or we have experience living in other countries and our own personal differences. But I wanted to share these examples with you because, there's been a bit of research on this, of how language is perceived. And it's just something to really think about when you are communicating, whether that is at work or in your personal life. So with me, when a Mexican says maybe, I finally realized that they mean no, and they're just being very polite. Exactly like Ivan said, it's a bluntly saying, instead of saying no, which is actually considered very rude. If I said no, and that's culturally, it's a very polite country. There's tends to be, a place where you avoid confrontation. And that's typical in, Latin America. It's typical also in Japan and countries, the particular countries where it might be perceived to be very direct, perceived in a negative way if you are very direct with your language. However, in other countries, you might find that it's a lot more likely that someone will be very direct. And the issues with this is if someone says to you, like the example I gave, there can be a cultural miscommunication and misunderstanding. So it's definitely something to really consider. And I hope sharing these phrases with you has given you some insight. It was something that I shared recently in my own course, and I go into a lot more detail and a lot more discussions around specific situations of how to handle, if you're giving feedback, or if someone says something, what they really mean, and how to decode language. If anyone is interested in joining the next course, I do have a couple of spaces for October, and the course is all about helping you with fluency and communication skills as a design and tech professional. So if you are interested, possibly in joining the next group, the next round we have in October, just send me a message. But I really hope that you found these phrases and understanding these particular sessions insightful, the situations insightful. But unless you have any questions, I think if you do have any questions, I will watch, if you're watching the replay, let me know. I really do love hearing from you and interacting with everybody. So let me know if you have any questions, if there's any particular phrases, or sometimes I had someone from my communities ask me, Gemma, is my boss being rude, or is that just a cultural way of speaking? And sometimes they need that clarification of, are they just a rude person? Is this considered rude in the UK? Or is just this how you communicate? Is this just a direct way of communicating? So if you have situations like that, I'd love to hear about them. If there have been any situations that you want to clarify or I can support you with, let me know. I'm happy to help you. But yes, I think we're just right on time. I hope you enjoyed today's session. I do go live every single week, so it's great to have you here. And if you're watching the replay, I appreciate it. But I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are. Take care. Bye.